Okay, it's 1 minute past, so we'll make a start. A few people still rolling in, but we'll just let them catch up. So, welcome, good morning, and thank you to everyone for jumping on today. Great to have so many people registered and flooded in the lobby. Today's session really is hopefully a bit of a knowledge share, information, lessons learned type vibe to help us understand and guide both ourselves and our customers and the people on the call today through the evolution of the Windows journey into 2022 and beyond. Hopefully today's kind of an insightful, informal session. So please drop any questions into the chat as we go. Great to kind of pick those up as we go if we get opportunity. If not, there'll be a time to capture them at the end. And if anything that we do miss on the Q&A, we'll wrap up in our follow-up actions and the bits and pieces. So with that in mind today, the aim of it is to get into where's Windows going in 2022. And to make that happen, you've got two lovely presenters from PowerOn. So you've got myself on the right there, James Dennis. For those of you who've not met me, I'm the head of sales at PowerOn, ultimately responsible for our sales strategy, offerings, and our customer engagements, which means I get to work with a lot of the lovely people on the call today. And I'm also joined by my partner in crime, Steve. I'll introduce himself.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. As James quite rightly said, my name is Steve Beaumont. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at PowerOn and also head of the Nerd Herd. So everything technical and geeky generally comes via me.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. So given that there's quite a few new faces on the call today, thought we would just take a few minutes just to introduce PowerOn for those of you that are new to us or perhaps haven't spoken to us for a while, so want to see what we're up to. But to basically introduce PowerOn in a nutshell, we're in the simplest statement, I like to describe us as kind of IT management and security specialists in the IT industry. Primarily, we're focused on delivering a range of managed services, professional services, and flexible support models to help our customers across a range of either ad hoc or ongoing engagements across a range of Microsoft and security vendors. We are headquartered out of the UK, but we support a range of national, European, and global customers and have a really nice split at the moment of around 50-50, actually, of both public sector and corporate. So some of those types of organizations up on the right. Probably should put a prize if your name's in the top right corner, you get a free webinar or something at the next one. But to kind of support those engagements across both industries, then we have the range of that accreditations and standards that we adhere to, both from that kind of technology perspective with Microsoft and Co. A nice new badge at the bottom middle around our new AVD Advanced Specialization accreditation, which we got recently, which is a great achievement and topical for today. But obviously adhering to the things like Cyber Essentials Plus and ISO accreditations. And a slightly potentially evolved piece for those of you who've not worked with us this year or so. And we now have got some great new partnerships in the likes of ArcServe and Fast Track Software to enhance and develop our ransomware, cybersecurity and backup portfolio. But for those of you who've known us longer, historically, that kind of Microsoft IT management and security house. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor of kind of who we are, what we do and where we do it. From a little kind of different lens, we obviously also focus heavily around our kind of social responsibility. So that really has two key flavors for us at PowerOn. It's around investing in both our communities at PowerOn and our local communities around our people, friends and family, and also investing in our environment. So we do that with two key partnerships at PowerOn. So we work with Mind, the mental health charity in the UK, to help both mental awareness, fundraising, and the bits and pieces, both internally at PowerOn for our staff. We all work from bedrooms and kitchen tables and stuff for many years. It's not great. So we know obviously keen to shed more light and support on that internally at PowerOn, but also with our community. So a lot of fundraising, marathons, and all that kind of good stuff to make that happen. And then taking that global, we have a really, really nice partnership with Ecology. If you've not seen these guys, go and check them out. They're amazing. But essentially, they're a carbon offsetting organization that help work with the businesses to plant trees across the world to kind of drive that carbon negative or carbon neutral approach to things. And we've been working with the team there for a couple of years now. And that's a really, really strong kind of program of work at PowerOn. So if you've not seen their work, go and check them out. It's quite interesting. So that's a little bit about who we are at a kind of mile high view. If anyone wants to know anything more about the services and offerings, please reach out to myself or anyone else. But really to get into the crux of why we're here today, it is to look at where is Windows going in 2022 and beyond. As you saw from the agenda, a little bit of a interesting steer with Windows 10 being the last version of Windows we were all aiming for, and now there's a fair few flavors of it out there. hopefully Steve and team will kind of get into the crux of what that means. So really, won't read through the agenda, but essentially some of the key points are really understanding what is available to us now. What are the paths, the options, Windows 11, 365, AVD, what do these flavors mean, look like for us all as organizations and as individuals? How can you start evaluating them? How could you start lining them up with your IT and business goals? But really more importantly, how can you actually effectively and securely manage these and leverage them to deliver your business goals? We'll then sort of wrap up with some closing thoughts, suggestions from what we've seen with our customers over the last few months around this, what Steve's seeing from the tech community, and take it from there really. But without further ado, I will hand over to Steve to get into some of these agenda points.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. Just to reiterate, again, as James mentioned at the beginning, there is a Q&A panel on the side. Please do feel free to pop your questions, bits and pieces as you get them into your minds. I'll try and keep an eye on it, but there's definitely a section at the end to be able to go through and review some of those and answer any that you do have. So, right, let's get started. So, initially, I'm just going to talk around where we currently are and what that looks like. Now, especially with Windows 10, we kind of geared up and we started to do this migration away from Windows 7, and it pretty much became a linear journey of looking at how we build them devices, we apply the configuration to them, we make sure that we're constantly getting content distributed out to them, and more importantly, make sure they're updated out and in place. That kind of completes the device lifecycle then, where we look at the refresh scenarios. If somebody does need to either move departments or change jobs and the device is repurposed, it's a refresh scenario, or if the device is end of life, it goes out into retirement. Now, them updates could be anything from just the normal monthly quality updates, or they could be the feature updates, as we moved away our way through 1909, 20H1, 20H2, and so on. Now, Windows 11 can fit into that cycle. We'll talk around some of the things that Windows 11 brings and what that means for us, but in essence, it could be just dropped into that update cycle, the same way that we do it with the feature updates, or it could be new devices coming into the mix. Now, them new devices, now we have obviously the options around either getting them pre-configured at the manufacturers, coming into the IT departments and getting built with things like Config Manager or Autopilot if you're looking to use the new provisioning methods. However, as has been really demonstrated by the recent last couple of years, we have quite a big problem when it comes to this point, where there's supply demands. What happens when we don't have staff that are actually in the office that we can go give it to them? We now need to start thinking a slightly bit different in that whole build and provisioning scenario of how we can actually get users onto a productive device. Additionally, we also now have a problem around basically this entire section here, where we don't have devices that are always on the LAN or heavily connected at the best of times. We've seen a huge reliance coming in when it comes to things like VPNs, especially when we have most of the configuration devices either done through GPOs, or we have a reliance on things like the content distribution for updates and stuff, where that's relying on on-premises connection for things like distribution points and stuff within Config Manager. So we have a little bit of a problem at the minute where moving forwards, our traditional linear journey of just build a physical device, hand it to a user, IT trundling around with vans full of equipment doing refresh scenarios, or the ongoing lifecycle management of devices is forming a little bit of a problem. So now it's not so much of a linear journey anymore. So originally we were just planning on having Windows 10, just getting new devices coming out and just keeping them up to date with patches. But obviously Microsoft has then gone and dropped the bombshell of, hey, here's a new version of Windows 11, which opens up the conversations of, well, when are we going to potentially then see a Windows 12 or 13? What's that going to look like? But Microsoft also started to introduce into the mix these new concepts around the Azure Virtual Desktop and also Windows 365. Now, I will dive a little bit more into these other couple of options because they do really now form a good part of any potential solution of how we do a desktop delivery model to actually help plug some of these gaps, but also strategically look at how we enable some of the other features or solutions within an environment, such as bring your own device or partner working and secure working. So, elephant in the room then, what is Windows 11 bringing to the table when it comes to the evolution of the actual Windows desktop? Now, in my personal opinion, and obviously it's early days for Windows 11, we've only had it out for a few months now, there's no major revolutionary change that we're seeing with it. It's not like the big jump from 7 to 10. I'm kind of skipping out 8 in between, but you get the idea. It is pretty much the same core operating system, which does mean that we're really lucky that the same deployment processes apply that we've either already started applying with Windows 10 or are looking at on how we transform the traditional way of doing 10 and can keep that same momentum going with Windows 11. The other good news is that most of the things like settings and policies and stuff do largely apply the same to Windows 11. You can pretty much guarantee that if you already have a very good baked in solution for your Windows 10 management, you can drop Windows 11 in and it will just work. Autopilot will go exactly the same with your imaging, with your task sequences. It's mainly just a case of swapping out the actual main Windows image. However, there's always got to be a but. One big thing that did crop up with this is that there are specifically some new hardware requirements when it comes to Windows 11. Now, the obvious one in the room would have been the whole TPM2. I've been talking about this as a requirement or a major recommendation when it came to Windows 10 at the first point. So a lot of organizations were already trying to make sure that they pivoted, but had quite an old legacy stock of devices that didn't have it, but didn't stop them going to Windows 10. It will prevent you from going to Windows 11 as an upgrade scenario unless you do start to put in, I want to say unsupported, not recommended, specific hacks into the registry to bypass any of the safety guards. So the TPM chipset is absolutely recommended and required to get to Windows 11 for some of the security features that Microsoft have embedded in it. Similarly, there is a CPU requirement. Now, while the TPM2, fine if you're not really wanting to use something like System Guard and stuff, could be something that could be mitigated. The CPU itself, you're not going to start ripping out CPUs off motherboards just to be able to do an upgrade, but it is a very key consideration as you start to do your assessments to be aware of which devices will officially support it, as the actual install will look for and actively block the upgrade on any CPU that is not on Microsoft's supported list. Now, the skeptic in me says this has a lot to do with things like the Spectre vulnerability from a few years ago, which put a severe impact on some of the virtualization capabilities related to the multi-threading aspects of the CPU microcode. Mainly because Windows 11 does try and introduce a lot of the virtualization-based security, so the VBS, things like hypervisor code integrity checks. So therefore, there would be a severe performance degradation if you didn't have the CPUs that put some of the workarounds for that original multi-threading vulnerability mitigation in it. The other thing to really call out, and only got this caught the other month or so, was that most organizations, when they do start to prep, will immediately go to their centralized group policy store and just copy the new group policies for new OS into the policy definitions folder. Please don't do that. Whereas before it was quite common practice, it's like, yeah, new set of ADMXs, just copy it across, drop it in there, and off we go. Microsoft have actually started to do some house cleaning when it comes to Windows 11 and the group policy conflicts. They've removed legacy settings, they've rearranged some stuff, and if you copy the Windows 11 into your central policy store, you do run the risk of both damaging group policies for Windows 10, especially if you go and then edit them from the new group policy sets, because settings are being removed and rejigged. The recommendation at the minute is if you quite likely, currently still a heavy Windows 10 house, is to leave your central policy store on the Windows 10 ADMXs and use a Windows 11 dedicated device with a special registry key to look at the local group policy settings on that device for editing specific Windows 11 group policies. Now, I'll come on to it a little bit later, and as James has already mentioned, there is going to be some follow-ups on this, and specifically some webinars around modern endpoint management. I will say that this does represent both a tipping point and a very good chance to look at other ways to manage your settings on Windows 11 rather than just purely on group policy, which may avoid that extra overhead of management altogether. Apart from that, it's pretty much the same OS. There is obviously some UI changes, etc., to be aware of and make sure they're communicated out to end users. And there's a couple of new settings where, quite frankly, you want to disable some stuff like widgets and potentially the team's personal client within the Windows 11 OS. There's some really useful blog posts on the Learning Hub for that I might have written recently. So talking about some of the options. So I mentioned previously the Azure Virtual Desktop and the Windows 365. I want to introduce some of the ideas around where they can fit. So you absolutely have the option of the traditional physical device, be it a desktop or a laptop, and that's where most organizations will be at present. But Microsoft, with these two other options introduced into the stack, do give you some nice quick wins and some potential opening up of brand new scenarios that you might not have been able to tackle previously. Physical device, absolutely. If it's there and the person's got it, they can generally get on and work. Different story, especially in this current climate, if that physical device breaks. And we ourselves internally have even had this scenario where a remote person has had a laptop that's gone faulty. Rather than losing all of the time we've been able to have to bring it back into base, get it swapped out, get a new one shipped, and having productive downtime, we're able to leverage some of these other features where we can click a button and basically have either a brand new, fully personal, dedicated Windows 365 session spun up that they can then access from any device, or just log on and access key resources or key applications from the Azure Virtual Desktop side. Let's have a very quick look at what those two look like, because there are some key differences on how PowerOn particularly tend to approach the difference between both the AVD side and the Windows 365 side. So dropping to my desktop, let's get rid of the annotations. So I am currently on a Windows 11 device. So this is my lovely Windows 11 device, bit of a cut down start menu and taskbar at the bottom because I'm in presenting mode. But that's probably the biggest difference, is to be able to communicate out to end users that the start menu yet again looks differently. So I know we've had to communicate from the whole Windows 7 to Windows 10, time to do it again. But users are pretty kind of au fait with the changes now when it comes to it, and things are generally still in roughly the right place, so it's not a huge heavy adoption piece. Now, like I said, having my physical device, great, I can crack on working as long as it's working. However, with both the Windows 365 and the AVD, this enables us to open the scenarios of being able to use basically any device, but not worrying too much about the security of the actual physical device that people are accessing our corporate applications and data from. So minimum case scenario, a web browser. Doesn't matter whether that is running on a Windows device or a Linux device, as long as it's a HTML based browser or HTML5 based browser, we can generally access this. Now, if I go to my Microsoft All Apps scenario, alongside accessing things like my Outlook and my OneDrive and stuff, I now have buttons for things like Windows 365. So any licensed user for it can basically be able to click on it, and then they can launch within the browser a full desktop. So I have this piece here, I can click open in the browser, and that will start to launch my desktop. Close that additional window I had open. Now, I have this for demo purposes basically open so I can connect to various local resources to talking about security, if you don't trust that device, you can basically turn off what you want. So I don't want to access local printers and I don't want file transfers, which means we then have a secure way of giving access to our apps and our data without the worry of people going and taking it back down to their unsecured local device and then doing what they want to it and getting into data loss protection scenarios. There we go. It's logging onto my desktop. It's in a browser now. You can see same familiar interface, and it's Windows 11 on this scenario. I can still do Windows 10. However, this is a quick and easy way, especially if you don't have capable hardware to hand, where I can start to look and test my Windows 11 strategy using Windows 365. It's designed to be run and managed using your corporate management tools, preferably Intune, but still takes the same policy sets, same look and feel. You can even see on my start menu, I have my recent jump list as I did on my physical one. So yes, I've got a couple of missing, but that's mainly because of my screen resolution. And I can access various things like my Teams client, and I can start to work and be productive without worrying about having a physical device that was built by IT and shipped out to me. Now, the good thing is as well, is it can absolutely do all the Teams redirection stuff. So we have options within our settings. I'm on a web browser without the plugin extension. So I've just got the basic remote audio, no camera. However, if I drop from here, disconnect that session, you can absolutely use the remote desktop client, and then I can connect in a much more fuller, richer scenario. This should ask me for my authentication, and it's going to use my Windows Hello. So let me just stare at the camera. There we go. That'll sign me in, and I'll basically get a full, rich local connection to my Windows 365. While that's connecting, you'll also see that I do have my AVD workspace and some of my applications. So you can absolutely use AVD for presenting a full desktop if that is a requirement. Oops, just minimize that while that logs on. But AVD also allows you to do the scenarios where you start to publish just applications. So not all the time is a full desktop required to be able to actually access resources. Sometimes users just need to be able to access something like SAP. So rather than giving them a full and more resource intensive full desktop, which also breaks their workflow, it might be better just to say, well, actually, no, you can access just the application on something like an iPad, which cannot run Windows 32 apps, and yet you securely then deliver just the application. So if I sign in, this is using a slightly different credential set, so I'm in a different domain as such. There we go. I now have just Word running as an application, no extra full desktop, and appears in my taskbar with just the little bit down at the bottom. So the AVD is more around that idea of being able to replace scenarios where you might have remote desktop services or terminal services, Citrix environments, and you can look at publishing core corporate applications, especially useful in low bandwidth scenarios, where you say, well, actually, if your device doesn't have a full VPN or you're on really bad broadband and it would be dragging large amounts of data for something like SAP, we publish the application. Or you might want that full desktop scenario where, fine, you're going to have lots of different applications. We want to give you a consistent environment approach. So here's back to my 365. This is dedicated to me just on a one-to-one basis. And now when I go into Teams, I should find that I have a lot better redirection of things like my devices. And you can see I've got my camera, etc. It's not spinning up at the minute because I'm also presenting via Teams Live, so the camera's locked. But I have that rich capabilities and I can still make phone calls, and it's offloaded to my actual device that I'm accessing it on. Just keeping an eye on questions really quickly, I did notice just one there around screenshots. There is actually a way. Now, I don't have this enabled in my environment because with demos, you can appreciate it from writing technical documents and stuff, I need to take screenshots, but you can actually enable a feature specifically within the Windows 365 side and probably with the AIP extension stuff on the AVD to stop screenshots being taken. If somebody does try to take a screenshot on the local device, it'll just create a blank screen and you can't actually then see what that content was. I will obviously say that does not stop somebody grabbing their mobile phone and taking a picture, but there's no scenario on the planet that can avoid that, apart from like screen filters that you can physically stick to the devices. I'll come back to some of the other questions in a little while because I'm going to dive into probably some of them as I get answered in a moment. So let me represent my screen. Here we go. So very quick introduction at a high level of some of them couple of options around the 365 and the AVD when we're talking around also having that physical device. Now I'm still keeping this at a very high level because obviously I could spend a ton of time. I usually do workshops over a day diving properly into it, but I just wanted to call out some of the top level, really high main points to focus on. So talking about the differences between physical devices, AVD and 365, absolutely all of them can be done on that view of a one-to-one personal session device if you absolutely need to. Obviously a physical device, you're generally going to hand it to a user and it's then their single-use device. AVD, I would not recommend using it in a per user single session scenario. It's much more designed, and I'll dive into it in a second, around that multi-session, allowing you to do, as per that next line, the density side, which gives you much more cost advantages, whereas the Windows 365 is solely a single user per session. So it's mirroring the fact of having that physical desktop environment into a virtual environment that they can just pick up and access and use anywhere. So the robust security features kind of goes right across the board on this, and it doesn't massively matter whether you're using Windows 10 or Windows 11. And as I can say, you can use Windows 10 and 11 on both AVD and 365. The biggest difference is if you do want to use the same really high level of security you get on a enterprise class piece of hardware on the physical side. So enterprise class, I'm talking around TPM2 chips, having all of the virtualization and security execution capabilities in the firmware of the CPU, so Intel TXT, UEFI, Secure Boot, and so on. You must make sure that you're looking at the Gen 2 VM deployments within AVD and 365. If they're in place, you can have the same level of security controls across them. Now, slightly debatable around the whole updatable to the latest release. I've specifically put across on the Windows 10 physical device side, because if you're on Windows 10, you're not going to see much more in terms of big feature updates. So whereas before we had the 1909, 20H1, all the way through to the current 21H2, don't expect to see Microsoft consistently releasing them incremental feature updates. The path will absolutely be to basically deploy Windows 11 as the next feature update and getting ready for that and deploying that, and then continue to go back down that same cycle. Thankfully, Microsoft have reduced it. We'll be going down from what was originally when it's first released, like 4 times or 5 times a year, down to the 2 times a year. We will now be standardizing on 1 release per year. But focus on getting to Windows 11 to then continuously do that. Hence the big red cross on Windows 10. Migration for feature update will be to Windows 11 and then moving forwards. Now the quickly updatable as well is kind of debatable. So there's obviously, as you start to deploy out to Windows 10, the capability to do it. You can get a device, as long as it is already up to date onto the next feature release fairly quickly, but it takes time to roll it out across thousands and thousands of desktops. Difference comes in on the AVD and the Windows 365. Particularly on the AVD side, you're talking about a much lower quantity of session hosts, so you can update them very quickly. And if done correctly, and usually our methodology, they tend to get rebuilt every single week anyway. So it's just a rolling exercise and you drop the latest update in and it's done within a week for that environment. The Windows 365, while you will still have a larger quantity of them devices, and we'll discuss that whole one-to-one mapping in a minute, it is as easy as just going right-click, re-provision to be able to get it up to date, and you can generally script that so you can do them on a bigger scale, probably quicker than rolling out across a Windows 10 physical estate. I will say, as we come into it in a little bit later, the WAS lifecycle across this is really important to consider, and I will touch on that. So talking about the costs on this, because obviously the whole Windows 365 and the AVD is obviously absolutely not free. And there's a couple of key points to kind of consider on here, and also the management overheads when it comes to it. And again, something we'll absolutely talk about on the modern management strategy side in a lot more detail. Now, the AVD side is all about that flexibility, is about being able to design it within your environment, look at what it costs look like, look at what the actual implementations for your usage case scenarios are, to tailor it a little bit more, introduce things like being able to rapidly scale, shut down when not needed. So the cost can be a lot more variable than Windows 365, which is a flat, fixed monthly fee, regardless of whether your user uses it for an hour a day or an hour a week, or uses it constantly for 24/7. So the cost comparison is not direct. However, if you consider, and these are just purely figures from the Microsoft website, take them with a pinch of salt, need to do proper analysis on it. A Windows 365 for that demo VM that I brought up with like 2 CPU and 8 gig of RAM is about £34.90 per user per month, flat fee. Whereas the the AVD side, you're talking around an environment with probably say 500 medium users would work out as something like 2,000 and a couple of £100 per month, but not per user. If you do the direct equated per user cost, that roughly worked out on AVD for them 500 users about £4.28 per user. Take it with a pinch of salt. Like I say, this is just very quick calculations from the Microsoft website. So you might immediately go, well, hang on a second, that's a big disparity. That's about £34 a month more for the Windows 365 platform. But yes, there is some concessions to be made between AVD, which gives you complete control over where you're placing it, what size VMs you're going to run, where in the region you're going to do it. Do you want it North Europe or South UK South? What networking style do you want on it? You're going to apply Azure virtual firewalls. You're going to lock it down. You're going to use premium storage. There's loads of variables that you have complete control over, but also carries the overhead of your staff knowing how to do it, how to manage it, DevOps practices, updating, monitoring of it, versus Windows 365, where Microsoft manage everything. All you have to decide is what network you want it to connect to that routes to your internal environment, if you need that. And that's a conversation for another day with the whole Azure AD join. So there's then pros and cons to think about when it comes to the direct cost translations between management overheads and the maintenance of the environment versus a very quick, simple click a button and you have a desktop that a user can use. And again, back to this density side, AVD gives you that density. You might have one session host VM where you're running 20 odd users on it, whereas that Windows 365 is a VM, one VM per one user scenario. So while the AVD would mean that fine, you might have 10 session hosts supporting 200 users, you can rapidly decommission them, upgrade them, rebuild them via automation, and it can basically go onto an almost autopilot scenario. Whereas the Windows 365 side, if you have 500 Windows 365 VMs, that's the equivalent of having 500 physical desktops in your environment, because you still have 500 OSs that you need to patch per month, deploy applications to, upgrade them to the next version of Windows 11, and so on within your WAS lifecycle. So there are still considerations across that side to think about as well. It's not a clear cut, yes, just go and choose this. So talk a bit more on the strategy side of this. How do we start to make these decisions? So the most important thing of all is obviously our users. And we've talked around for years around trying to understand a bit more around the roles that these users play in terms of their needs. There's lots of different methodologies for this, not one bucket fits all. Take these on screen as examples. You may have them, you may not have them, but you should absolutely at least identify medium, low, medium and high usage scenarios of like whether they need heavy devices with lots of RAM, whether they can work within it, whether they need to install applications, whether they just need to be able to access something simple like Excel. So if you took a regular finance user, for example, they might be classed as an information worker, and all they need is Excel primarily and a not HR system, but a finance system to do their job. How would we look at delivering that out to the end user? Do they really need a set physical device and a powerful device just to access Excel? Or can we look at different scenarios that allows them just to get access securely to the application, in this case something like SAP, and Excel, but with access to the files and where they reside within the business? The good news is that all of these should now be predicated with the thought process of just designing across Windows 10 and 11. We don't need to mix in, as we did previously with a lot of remote access scenarios and stuff, Windows Server. How do we make that look like the desktop? What different controls has that got on top of it? That sits in the data center rather than actually where we normally have our clients. We're leveling the playing field here. We're designing on Windows 10 or 11. We're looking at exactly the same scenarios and treating it in the exact same scenarios as physical desktop or virtual desktops in this case. We also talk about this idea of zero trust initiatives, making sure that whatever we apply, we don't mind where they're accessing it from. It should always be secure, and changing it to pivot on things like identity on how we control access to these. Talk about controlling access. Physical devices, absolutely going to be a Windows device. How we access them services comes into play on that. The other two open up them scenarios, as I mentioned, around considerations of that whole bring your own device scenario, working with partner organizations, working with contractors. We don't want to have to consider sending them out either physical devices or, and I see this quite often still, giving partners or contractors a VPN credential and asking them to install a VPN on an untrusted and unmanaged device. That's a really big no in my books. Removing scenarios like that, making it more secure, looking at how we deliver it is where this lot starts to come into play and we think about it. So if there are delivery platforms, we obviously need to think about what we do in terms of the management side of it. And absolutely, as we think about how we do with our physical devices, that zero touch provisioning, how can we make it as streamlined as possible to either give them a physical device or spin up and access a virtual environment comes into play. And it should follow similar lines across all three of them. The WAS process I'll come back to because that is hugely important. Regardless of what our delivery platform is, we still need to maintain and keep it updated. And the security controls should be consistent across everything. This again comes back to the idea that we are managing the Windows desktop, not server environments, not customized, not, oh, it's over here, so it needs something slightly different. It should be consistent no matter how they're accessing it. The controls should be the same. And something that often gets overlooked is how we actually bring the analytics into this. It's all very well and good deploying something, and we did this all the time with group policy. We applied a setting and just kind of went, yeah, I think that's applied, we should be good. How do we actually use the tool sets available to understand what we're applying? Is it secure? And is it performing? And this is where the management platforms comes into play. How we look at the Azure services that back end this, endpoint manager with things like Intune or config manager, pulling out the analytics and getting ready with things like Defender for Endpoint, which is part of the licensing SKUs for this most of the time now, to actually understand the security controls as well. Now, I mentioned there very quickly, and it's probably another conversation for another time, a lot of this is predicated on about making the most maximum value of your investment in the current Microsoft licensing platforms that you have available. A lot of this, like AVD licenses and stuff, come with things like the Windows E3 licenses that you should already have within your physical desktops. There's other SKUs that will include things like the Intune stuff. So how do we leverage that investment to make all of this lot come together? Now, obviously, there's going to be lots of business decisions around this. And the main thing I'm trying to stress here is that it's no longer a single choice. It's not about we can only go down this route, or we must only use Windows 365, or we must only use AVD. It's about working out what your requirements are in the first place. So sitting down, defining out them business requirements and saying, we don't have a need for bring your own device. We do have a need for this. We've got to be able to do that. One quick scenario that was working with a customer on this side, they leveraged the AVD platform specifically for a need to reduce the amount of time it takes in break-fix scenarios. So they have users all over the world. If a user's laptop goes down and they can't fix it remotely, it would take a lot of downtime to organize sourcing a laptop, shipping it out, users coming in, collecting it, or getting it delivered to the end user's house. And what could be down from a few hours if they're close by in the stock to a week if they can't get hold of laptops, especially in the current climate, was not acceptable. So now it's a case of, while you cannot access your physical laptop, you can access key resources from here, drop them into a group, send out an email, go to this URL, they're up and operational within minutes. And it's about measuring what that business and impact is, what affects your user productivity, to help decide which routes to go down or where to bring in these solutions in one form or another. It might be that the productivity says they must have access to high-end applications on an ad hoc basis. You can start to look at what solution fits that, and that might be more of a Windows 365 platform than AVD, which is usually more locked down in terms of the application profile. Take your time to analyze that, work out what your gap analysis is, where things might be coming into play within your roadmap already that can alter your decisions, and start to look at the timelines where these things start to fit in, and then start to work to design out what the potential solutions look like, either with assistance from partners like ourselves or with your in-house teams, to understand where these building blocks fit. And then absolutely just verify it. Do small proof of concepts for low cost, especially with some of these being in the cloud. Like I say, if you want to look at your Windows 11 strategy and you don't have spare physical devices because of shortages, spin up a Windows 365 environment. Use that as your test bed for a few months to see what Windows 11 looks like with your current security controls in your environment. Use the tools that you may have at your disposal to help you with your business decisions and look and feel of the environment. So I've mentioned it loads now, and that is around that life cycle management. So PowerOn have a pretty much standardized approach that we recommend when it comes to this. And this breaks down to the various different phases. So I'll dive into these in a couple of seconds, but the validation and the preparation phase is usually where you need to start. And that validation phase absolutely comes into play, especially with the Windows 11 side. And then when you're ready, you can start looking at how you start to deploy it out to your environment. So during the validation and preparation phases, if you're still in that traditional config manager world, you've got to make sure your tool sets are up to date. And that doesn't just mean updating config manager, it also means updating the dependencies within it, things like the Windows ADK for the supported level, making sure that doesn't impact on previous versions, making sure that your software update groups are ready for it, making sure that your WIM images and your task sequences are ready, and there's quite a fair bit of work to make sure your tool set is done in that preparation phase. Intune, rightly, is pretty much 0-day support for most stuff, and it's just there and it's ready to use, and you just start deploying as you need it without lots of admin overhead just to get your tool sets ready. But in that validation phase, as I mentioned, it was about making sure that your environment is ready to go to things like Windows 11. So looking at, as I mentioned, that hardware assessment layer, making sure that your estate can actually take Windows 11, and also about when you do start to roll it out, using the analytics to make sure that you're monitoring what is going out at that time. Similarly, with your applications in that validation and preparation phase, limited testing will probably be needed for Windows 11 for your applications. It's still generally the same core, so you shouldn't have too much of a problem migrating your applications with any compatibility issues. But there's been numerous times now where Microsoft have released both quality updates as well as feature updates where something has caused degradation in either performance or how an application specifically works, that you should still be doing on a monthly basis testing of key applications against releases to make sure they do work. Now, I have just kind of put in that test-based name. There is a tool set from Microsoft coming through that isn't specifically devised for this. However, I have started to look at how we can kind of take benefits of it. And Microsoft Testbase actually allows a lot of automation around the deployment, the installation, the uninstallation, the opening, and even unit tests of applications against multiple different monthly releases and feature releases and different operating systems with very little effort in terms of just setting it up and then letting it run monthly and getting the report statistics back that tell you, did it install, did it not install. When it last opened, it was running at like 5% CPU usage. This quarterly update, we're now seeing it run, this monthly quality update, we're now seeing it run at 60% CPU usage. Have a problem if you roll out the involves a little bit more, you might potentially be able to use it. Now, very quickly, because I've mentioned this a couple of times, let me drop out of this slide and just go to my endpoint analytics. If you are already using Intune or you're in co-management or tenant attach mode from Config Manager, or if you're not already, please do really start to think about doing this. There is a wonderful report on the Work Anywhere report in Endpoint Analytics that will help show you which devices are not capable of running Windows 11. So you can see within this environment, I have 3 specific devices where the CPU is just not capable of running Windows 11, and therefore upgrades will be blocked to them. Previously, we had other devices within this report, and it was coming back and saying that the storage was too low, there wasn't enough space, the TPM chip wasn't right, they weren't running secure boot. You will get that visibility from this report. So absolutely recommend, if you haven't seen this and you are in Intune, go look at it. If not, start thinking or talk to us to help onboard your devices, if for nothing else, to get this report back in. There are some other ways to do it, but that takes some automation and some custom scripting and stuff to be able to deploy out PowerShell scripts to gather that information. So the other phases between that Windows lifecycle management are obviously the deployment phases. One thing I will say is don't overthink it. There's so many different ways to skin this cat. You can break it down very granularly to protect yourself. But there are some new developments coming through that will help you simplify this no end. The main one being the Windows Update for Deployment, Windows Update for Business Deployment Service, such a nameful, where there is now some intelligent processing done in the cloud. I wanted to stay away from the buzzword, but I'm going to have to use it. There is some AI analysis done by Microsoft on your devices, trying to work out that spread of devices to try and find a good sample set of the type of hardware, the firmware levels, the software levels that can do a representative sample set of a much larger group to deploy to first, to get very good confidence that it can continue to roll it out across more devices. It also means that you can basically still use update rings, but try and simplify them to test. So not just purely IT, try and pick a little bit wider, but say a good 5–10% of your estate. Then go to your pilot and pick a wider range of devices across your different business units and pick, say, maybe 25% of the estate. And then go for broad, which is basically the rest of your estate. But use the deployment service to say, I want to hit on average a target of, say, 500 devices per week, and have its intelligence split them down more gradually, and then it will stage the rollout across them individual target groups within that broader one, without you having to go and try and break it down manually, and let the intelligence of the system decide, here's a good sample set. If those devices don't update or there's problems with it, push the other ones much further back into the deployment cycle to give you time to fix them, so you don't consistently get the same error repeated over and over until you've had a chance to go and fix it. And again, monitor it. Use the Microsoft Update Compliance monitoring to gain visibility into that, so you can see what's happening in them rings, see which ones are struggling, resolve them to allow it to flow before it then gets to the end of it and you're just left with a load that can't update. So closing thoughts from myself before I hand back to James. There's obviously quite a bit of information in there to take account of. The main takeaways for me that I was hopefully trying to explain on this, that Windows 11 isn't a major uplift or major revolutionary where you have a lot of things to consider, but there are key things around things like hardware that you need to be considerate of, get the analysis done, work out where you're potentially going to have to bring in hardware refresh as part of your upgrade. Your deployment tools and stuff should generally work if you have them bedded in well enough and it's working for Windows 10, flow that through for Windows 11. Take your same management style in terms of looking at your policy settings and stuff and take that through to Windows 11, but start to look at some of the other options from Microsoft within AVD and Windows 365 to both open up new scenarios that you might not have previously been able to achieve, and also unblock yourself from scenarios that have been brought on with the current climate condition, with everyone working more heavily remotely, and enable quicker response for things like Teams in break fix, partner solutions, partner organization contractors, and generally delivery of applications over low bandwidth scenarios. Put these into your potential toolbox and use them where they fit the most, and enable yourself to be able to introduce new operating systems on a much faster cadence by utilizing things like virtualization to help you achieve that. And we'll talk much more about the actual methods of delivering that in detail in the actual modern management webinar. James, over to yourself, good sir.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Steve. Really appreciate that. So obviously a lot of information there, a lot of different layers and technologies and threads that the kind of the workflows and work streams from Microsoft in that desktop environment are taking. So for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with how we have supported customers and where you can kind of take action today, there are a range of kind of engagement models at PowerOn that we support customers in this journey. You know, Steve touched on some really key bits on, you know, is it a low cost pilot? Is it a really quick and easy proof of concept to make sure you can really understand what it is and if it's going to work for you? But we can essentially help from a range of tactical free 2-hour workshops. You know, could be a simpler topic of, does Windows 11 or Windows 365 make sense for your organization? all the way through to supporting with business case justification at technology and business level with solution alignments, that kind of deep dive output documentation to help your business model. We can obviously get hands-on and help with deployments for those of you who know us. But if the headache of the Windows journey and landscape changing, patching, updating, as well as the modern management, endpoint management background to look after all of this is just too much, you don't have the bandwidth, the skill, the time, or it's just not in your interest of your IT team to deliver that operational baseline, we do have a range of managed services to take that off your hands. But I appreciate, as anything, there's a few places to start. So if we just jump to the last slide from me, and then we'll jump into some really good questions that have come through in the chat. From speaking to customers, where I would recommend starting today, or where you would perhaps restart or revise your Windows story, would be one of these three areas at a no cost entry level, really. So on the left hand side, myself at PowerOn and the teams at Microsoft, who we work very closely with, we all offer a range of complementary assessments, workshops, some of the bits and pieces around Windows 11, 365, AVD. They range from 1 or 2 hours through to half day, full day sessions. So, if they are of interest, they're on our website. We can work with you and or Microsoft to make those happen. So they can be nice ways to get your teeth into things at a relatively strong level, but without obviously having to go and raise requests for funds. As Steve's alluded to, it will be live shortly, but if you jump on our learning hub, there's loads of resources, but we are actually in about 5 or 6 weeks running a managing your Windows journey, which will take a look at all of those back-end tools that Steve's touched on: Endpoint Manager, Config, Intune, Autopilot, Defender for Endpoint, AAD. How do these things work together or separately, to make that management lifecycle that bit easier? And last but not least, they're a friendly bunch, so am I, hopefully. But, if you've got a PowerOn account representative, go and speak to them. If they don't, reach out to myself. The details are at the start of the slide. Reach out to info at PowerOn. Anyone at PowerOn from the technical or sales team would be happy to have a virtual coffee, even if it's just 5 minutes, to explain what we're seeing with this type of tech in other customers in your industry, and hopefully share not just that technical lens of where we see things going, but also that kind of industry flavor to what's happening as well around you, because it's just great to know that other people are in the same boat, and we can hopefully share some of those insights. So that would be my recommendations on where to start. But if there are any questions, we'll share the slides, the links, all that kind of good stuff after the call. But I think there's some really good questions coming in. So I think, Steve, I don't know if you want to answer any on the chat or out loud, but if anyone else on the call does have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat now, and we'll go through them. I think there's a few more coming in.
Yeah, so I've just been trying to answer a couple of them in the chat channel. However, it's probably easier for me to talk to some of them. I'll skip some of the ones around recordings and stuff because we haven't answered that. So somebody was asking a really good question around the Cyber Essentials. Now, for those that are aware of Cyber Essentials, they are bringing personal devices and bits and pieces into scope a lot more. Probably something that I can dive into much more on a one-to-one conversation, but to keep the summary really high level, it obviously comes down to what security controls you put, what the definition of where data is residing on them devices, to how they're accessing it, and whether they're accessing the internal network. But in essence, you can absolutely put security controls and stuff in place, make sure that risk assessments are done, and you have statements of controls and policies around it that would allow you to actually access the Windows 365 or AVD environment from a home user's device without having to worry about what or how dirty that user's home device is. Obviously, some caveats on that, need to fully understand it, but it is a use case scenario for them type of things. Already answered that question previously around taking screenshots in Azure. Yes, you absolutely can. It actually does look really cool, and it confuses the bejeebers out of me half the time when I do go to screenshots and when I've been playing with it and it's just a blank screen. The Windows 365 with identity agent access. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Obviously, there are the controls that you can do to allow USB redirection and stuff. So if users do have either physical smart cards or you want to do the whole virtual smart cards with certificates, there are methodologies for doing that. We did do some work with a NHS organisation a while back, specifically on, was it either AVD or RDS, around the virtual smart card side. And there are some stuff that there are virtual smart card agents that are required for that, but there are stuff that you can specifically do around that to help. So if you want to know more on that one, just reach out to us and we can probably dive into it better. What is the best approach for upgrading Windows 10 VM Azure based to Windows 11? So I'm taking the assumption that you're talking around Windows 365. If it is just a standard Azure based VM, then you basically just have to go and do the feature update or rebuild it in a portal side. If it's the Windows 365 side, it is quite easy. You can again do the feature update if you want. Treat them like a physical desktop. I can't stress this enough. Windows 365 should be treated like a physical desktop in terms of ongoing lifecycle management. You can reprovision it and you can click the button and it'll basically tear it down and redeploy it, but you need to make sure that you have very good robust controls in place for things like OneDrive folder redirection, making sure that your enterprise state roaming is on there, users are not saving stuff locally, your applications are delivered by the portal, because it would be like having a fresh PC. So feature update might be the best way to go and do that, unless you have a very dynamic building environment. Does this mean you can use low spec hardware to deliver Windows 365? Absolutely. So I'm currently using a temporary device because my main device, the screen bust on it. This device is nowhere near as powerful. I'm hating using it locally. I can just jump on my Windows 365 environment and carry on working with things like BI and Power BI and stuff at the speed that I want it to. Absolutely use lower spec hardware and stuff to deliver it. That does not negate the need though, if those lower spec hardware are still joined to your environment as domain joined devices, you still have a duty of care to keep them up to date. It doesn't mean you can stop patching all of them if they have access to your network. Do you have more use case scenarios that apply to Windows 365 or AVD? Yes, quite a few. I might come back to that one depending on time. Let me answer some of the other questions first because I could talk for days on use case scenarios. Could we also cover how DA would be replaced? So DA, I'm assuming you mean direct access. Probably not much time to cover it within this. That's certainly something for the modern management webinar. If you see the registration bit on there, you'll see specifically there's a line about reducing the reliance on on-premises Active Directory mainly, but it covers the same thing. This is about how we start to use things like app proxy for gaining access to website-based stuff within our internal infrastructure, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, or if you're just looking at getting access to certain key applications, this is absolutely where AVD specifically might come into play and just publish them an application. No need for a VPN or in any way, shape or form then. You can just access it as either a web resource or built into your start menu and publish that application, which is running in essence within your boundaries of your data center without having to traverse any direct access or VPN tunnels. Similarly with Windows 365, but it's less of a use case scenario to replace DA. DA replacements would generally be with AVD. How do we arrange time to discuss our projects? James is already over that. That's brilliant. Earlier question, the VM is not capable in analytics due to TPM and firmware. Oh, I apologize on that one. I don't think I saw the previous question on that one. Maybe if you could update us a little bit more on that one, Nick, that would help. Oh, was that on the, on the approach to it? Yes. So now I know exactly what you're on about. So this goes back to one of the slides where I was saying specifically around the need for Gen 2 VMs. The Windows 11 hardware requirement basically says that you must have UEFI firmware. Therefore, you must have secure boot and stuff like that enabled onto it, which is very specifically why if you're running on a Gen 1 VM in Azure, you will be seeing that you are not capable to upgrade it to Windows 11. So you will need to basically completely rebuild that VM. Does Windows 365 or AVD allow multiple screens? Absolutely. The only reason I can't demo that today is because I have an ultra-wide monitor and the screen resolution's really huge, and you wouldn't be able to see anything on my screen. But in normal practice, I can absolutely have AVD and stuff running and splitting across my multiple monitors. So that's a definite yes. Oh, desktop analytics. Sorry, I went down the DA route of direct access. So desktop analytics is deprecated. If you haven't seen the announcement for that, basically in November of this year, it will be turned off. So you have to think about how you migrate away from desktop analytics. The usual approach on that one is twofold. So it is a combination of the endpoint analytics to give you some visibility around just generally what's there and capable of upgrading, and some performance stats on the applications. The main thing that they're kind of replacing it for, because it was desktop analytics was good for defining out what your groupings looked like for your update rings. That's the Windows Update for Business deployment service that is designed to take that into an automated fashion and do that intelligent grouping of your deployment rings into staged groups. There is a blog post on the Learning Hub that I wrote that does cover that in a little bit of information. But again, as usual, if you want to speak more about it, you can probably guess by now, I'm quite happy to talk, so just reach out to us. I appreciate that we're way over time. The only other question I can see in here at the moment is around the other usage scenarios. I think that we'll probably need to pick that up on a different one, but it is generally at a top level, break fix scenarios, being able to provide secure access to partners, partner organizations, contractors, being able to give, oh, here's a usage scenario. We've got a customer at the minute that currently spends thousands of pounds on really high spec hardware to be able to do very detailed CAD design, rendering and stuff like that. But those workstations are not in use 24/7. So they're looking to see whether they can use a Windows 365 with a GPU or AVD with a GPU, sorry, with high spec VMs, graphics capabilities, and be able to use it on a scheduled basis where people can go on, use it, come off it, and it will then spin down when not in use to avoid the cost of really expensive hardware, which goes out of date rapidly, and then they have to go and get new ones. So there's another use case scenario. But again, reach out to us if you need to on that one, and I'm quite happy to discuss all sorts of weird and wonderful ones on how you can use it. Another, actually, I'm going to continue talking. Another really good one is around the security space. So your administrators. So there's always been this concept of privileged access workstations before in the past, where you, an admin would have a dedicated, very heavily locked down device that they need to go out and go and get out of the cupboard to log on to a different set of credentials in a specific network port, so on, to go and administer things like Exchange within the data center. One area that we're working on at the minute and working with customers is how we can use a Windows 365 or AVD environment to mimic that and provide a isolated, away from your core network, privileged access workstation scenario for managing your cloud environments. So having a different set of accounts, limiting your credential theft, and limiting your security risk posture for managing Exchange Online, Office 365, and so on from a secure, dedicated environment without the need for additional hardware and so on, no matter where they are, or tied down with things like conditional access controls and so on to be able to manage that and MCAS. And I think that's me about our speed, and I don't think we've got any more questions coming through. But if you do, the email addresses and stuff are on there. James's email address is on there. Mine as well is just steve.beaumont@PowerOnPlatforms, or you can reach out to info@PowerOnPlatforms if I'm busy and you want to speak to the wider team. Please do get in contact with us. We're always happy to talk about stuff like this and see where we can actually help you. So unless you've got any last words, James, I think that's...
No, yeah, just thank everyone for the time. And like I said, keep an eye on the Learning Hub for the bits and pieces. There'll be a similar session, as I said, in 5-6 weeks around that management back-end side of it. I think there potentially might be one question's just dropped in, but if we did miss anything, just drop us an IM, an email or call, and we're happy to pick it all up and drop some time in to reconnect. But just want to thank everyone for the time. Appreciate we're a little bit over, but all of the information from today will be shared. And like I said, if there's any questions, we'll answer them or we'll catch you on the next one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers all. Thanks.